The Atlanta Hawks right now feel like one of these teams that is on the edge, that is at this tipping point for their franchise. What Atlanta Hawks basketball is going to look like for the next couple of seasons is going to be determined by what they do with the deadline as well as in this upcoming offseason. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it makes them one of the most interesting teams in the league to me right now. Now, when you're talking about Atlanta, it does feel like the conversation has to begin with Trae Young. He's a very divisive player. He's someone that I've had a lot of opinions on in the past and still do. And he's someone that this conversation kind of all gets based around. And there's all these takes about how, oh my gosh, is Trae Young actually all that good? Despite what I've said about Trae Young in the past and some of the annoyances in terms of the way that he plays, in terms of trying to draw fouls, in terms of taking 35 footers in the middle of the play, he's extremely, extremely good. So I don't want any of this to come off as, oh my gosh, Tucker thinks that Trae Young is bad. That's not what I'm saying. But it's more about how you can evaluate your roster, figuring out what to do with the team. It's not about Trae. It's about how do you build a competitive roster. And some of the negative stuff that people are saying about Trae, I think is more so just twisting this idea that actually is true into something that isn't, which is that he isn't very good at basketball. That's not true. What is true is that there's a specific play style and there's a specific way that you have to play when Trae Young is on your team. And it's a play style that isn't always conducive to great chemistry and camaraderie and morale within the team because he controls everything. And there are moments during these games where you can tell that the other guys are a little bit fed up with that. And I think that feeds into this idea of this tipping point in Atlanta where ordinarily a team performing the way they have to begin the season wouldn't be, super catastrophic. It would be annoying, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. But because of kind of the vibes around the team, and I think a lot of that has to do with Trae and his play style and the team's play style, this feels like a massive, massive moment for Atlanta. And it feels even more like that because when you look at the roster, I'm really not sure what the solution is moving forward for this team. Because at this point, it is very clear that not only in their current construction are they not a title contending team, but also their ability to get there, to raise up to that level, seems extremely limited as well within the current roster that they have. Like Trae Young is very good. DeJounte Murray is very good. They don't always work super well together, but individually, they're a very talented backcourt. They do have some other guys on the roster that maybe you could see continuing to go and improve over the next couple of years. Okongwu being one of those guys, Jalen Johnson being one of those guys, maybe you're a big DeAndre Hunter guy, whatever the case may be. Even if you account for some improvement from those players over the next handful of seasons, this roster construction is not one that is going to be making the conference finals or contending with the other really good teams in the Eastern Conference. And when you're at that point, and when you've invested in multiple coaches in the Trae Young era, when you've invested in multiple different versions of the roster, trading future stuff for DeJounte Murray, and you still haven't gotten to that point of, yes, they made the conference finals the one year, but you haven't gotten to the point of a consistent roster that the year starts and it's like, wow, the Atlanta Hawks are a top 3 team in the East. You haven't gotten to that point. And it makes me wonder if they're going to try and solve that problem in one way or the other. Of course, the only two ways in which you do that are you continue to invest in the group, you trade away some of the younger guys and really try and improve from there, or potentially you break some things down and reset. And that decision, that tipping point that we're at for Atlanta is extremely, extremely interesting to me because theoretically, on paper, from a talent perspective, they should be really, really good, yet it feels like year after year, we are disappointed with them. Now, for me personally, it's a very difficult conversation to have because Trae Young, as I said, is very good and is extremely productive for Atlanta. But if you were to go around the league and say, hey, we're going to trade Trae Young, because I think that's a conversation that some people are going to start to try and have and say that Atlanta needs to reset. They need to get stuff for Trae. They need to change things. Specifically going towards that mindset I was talking about earlier of the way you have to play and how that kind of changes the chemistry of your team. If they did that, let's just say, for example, tomorrow, Atlanta says, you know what, we're ready to move on. Who wants Trae Young? I don't know that there would be a lot of teams jumping up and down to trade a lot of stuff. There'd be plenty of teams that would like to have Trae Young on the team, but to trade a lot of stuff, like to trade a Donovan Mitchell level trade package from a couple of seasons ago from Utah to Cleveland, to trade that level of stuff in exchange for Trae Young, I think there would be a lot of teams that would hesitate to do that because of his size, because of his lack of effort defensively, how bad he is defensively. It's been a little better this year, but that's not saying much because he was the worst individual defender in the entire league prior to this year. All that stuff combined makes him a very difficult player to trade and to try and break down and tear down the roster with, in comparison to some of these situations I've talked in recent videos about where, obviously Oklahoma City trading away Paul George and Russell Westbrook, building to what they have now, Brooklyn trading away Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving because they were forced to, and trying to build what they have now. Kind of that mindset of let's trade Trae for a ton of stuff and build something else. I don't think that works for Atlanta because I don't think that his value, strictly from a trade perspective, he's an incredible player, but he's a hard player to convince yourself to trade a lot of stuff for. Makes it extremely difficult, in which case it seems like Trae Young is going to be there for the foreseeable future. So at that point, you look at, do we try and trade DeJounte Murray? Because even though he is very good, him and Trae, it just doesn't, it's not that it doesn't work. It doesn't work at a high level. Like, it can work from a perspective of you start the game well because Trae makes some shots. He comes off the floor. Now DeJounte's doing his thing, but there's no connection there. There's no, oh man, DeJounte and Trae Young are both on the floor at the same time. I'm really nervous about this. That's not a thing. It's they're both kind of doing their own thing separately or together. And it makes you wonder, okay, maybe that there's a possibility there, DeJounte Murray getting traded. And I think that there is a lot of value in terms of, maybe not more than Trae Young, but there is a lot of value for a guy of Murray's ability defensively, creator, offensively, all that stuff. And I do think that's a conversation that can be had. But again, I don't know that that elevates Atlanta to any kind of new level. And if you're trading him away in a way to go backwards, then that just makes things that much weirder around Trae. And then, like I said, you have some of the younger guys you could potentially cash in on. But what I'm getting to, and my point here is, Atlanta, from an individual perspective, has a lot of talent, has a lot of players that are going to be good and are going to continue to grow and improve. But when you look at their roster right now, you have to ask yourself two questions. One, are we a contending caliber team with this group right now? Obviously, the answer is no. They're probably, best case, going to end up right around 500, a couple of games over 500, best case scenario this season. If the answer to that question is no, you'll say, okay, well, is this current roster capable, with some internal improvement and growth over the next handful of years, year two, whatever, is that group capable of being one of the better teams in the East, a semi-contending roster, a contending roster? Is that possible? And I would argue that right now the answer to that is also no. And they're in a very similar situation to a handful of other teams in the Eastern Conference, a team like Toronto, for example, where obviously there's going to be growth and improvement from guys like Scotty Barnes and OG, but still contending status with this roster feels very out of reach. And I think that's where Atlanta is as well. And when the answer to both of those questions is no, when you're not a contending team now, when it's hard to see a path towards becoming one without significant roster change, that's how you get to the point of, okay, well, we need to change the roster. We need to trade Trae Young or DeJounte Murray, or we need to trade some of the young guys and some picks. We need to trade Capella, whatever the case may be, in order to try and get ourselves to that point eventually, or obviously in a more immediate and short-term sense. If it were me, I would be totally okay exploring any and all roster possibilities with this Atlanta group. I would not be concerned if I was running the team in Atlanta about this idea of, oh man, if we trade away this guy or that guy, all of a sudden, we missed this huge opportunity to where the team could have really come together and been this awesome group. It's very clear that this team is going to be, maybe the 6th seed in the East if they're having a good year one year, and that's about it. And if that's where you are and you've done it for a few years, it's not like this is a small sample size of a handful of seasons in Atlanta. They've been doing this for a little while with different versions of the team, but they've been doing this for a little while. And at that point, I certainly wouldn't be nervous to explore any trade possibilities. I mean, I really like Jalen Johnson. I like Okongwu a lot. Obviously, we talked about Trae and DeJounte. I'd be willing to listen to anything on anybody if I felt like at some point it was going to help my team become this like contender or semi-contender that every team in the league is striving to be. And that to me is what makes Atlanta extremely interesting, is that I can look at the situation and say, okay, this feels like a break it down kind of deal, but it feels like an unrealistic expectation when it comes to the value they could actually get in return for their players. Yet also, it feels unlikely that we're going to have some massive shift in terms of what the outcome of Atlanta's season this year moving forward is going to look like. And what that is a place that nobody wants to be. It's in the middle of the NBA. It's a team with no upward mobility. It's a team with no downward mobility. You're just going to be a 42 to 45 win team, best case scenario, over the next handful of seasons. And I'm curious if there is a breaking point at some point for Atlanta at the deadline or in the offseason, because to me, this is a roster that, if your goal is eventual title contention, certainly needs some significant changes.